The desert storm rolled across the Wild West like a hungry beast, and the night sky flashed with pale blue lightning when Emily Carter opened her eyes inside the old wooden cabin, her heart pounding fast as she tried to remember how she got there. The cabin was small, cold, and smelled of dust and rain, and the thin door shook every time the wind screamed outside. She sat up slowly, confused and scared, her wedding dress torn at the bottom from running through the desert earlier that day. She had been traveling to the frontier town of Red Rock for her arranged marriage, dreaming of a normal life with a simple husband, but now she was sitting alone in an abandoned cabin with no idea where her groom or her future had gone. Before she could stand, the door creaked open with a long, slow sound, and her breath caught in her throat. A tall Apache man stepped in, his dark hair wet from the storm, his tired eyes showing more pain than anger. His name was Takoda, though Emily did not know it yet. He did not move toward her. Instead, he placed his weapons on the far side of the room, away from both of them, and then sat on the wooden floor, keeping a respectful distance. The firelight from the small lantern he carried showed the hard lines of his face, the deep exhaustion in his movements, and the heavy burden he seemed to carry on his shoulders. Emily froze, unsure if he was friend or enemy, rescuer or captor, but he only looked at her with a calm sadness and whispered softly, "Stop me when it's too much." His voice was low and tired, as if he had said those words many times in his life. Emily did not understand what he meant, and the confusion made her heart beat even faster. Was he warning her? Was he asking for her trust? Or was there something worse coming toward them in the storm? Outside, thunder cracked close to the cabin, but inside, the silence grew heavy and tense. Emily searched the room with her eyes, looking for a way out, but the windows were sealed with old planks and the storm outside was too strong for her to run into. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper, "Why am I here?" Takoda looked at her slowly, as if choosing his words with great care, but instead of answering, he turned his head toward the window, his face tightening with alertness. It was clear he was listening for something dangerous. Then the narrator's voice enters the story, saying, "To understand why a lonely Apache warrior and a frightened frontier bride ended up in a storm-beaten cabin on the edge of the desert, we must go back 2 days earlier," and the scene shifts to Red Rock, a rough frontier town where wooden buildings stood strong but people whispered nervously about trouble in the desert. Emily had arrived there wearing her white dress, carrying a small hope in her heart that her arranged groom would meet her and start a new life with her. But instead of a warm welcome, she found confusion. Her groom had not shown up. No one knew where he was. Some said he might have been delayed. Some said he ran away. But others whispered something darker, that an outlaw gang had been seen near the town, and they were looking for someone connected to Emily's groom. Emily had walked outside town to calm herself and think, hoping for answers, but she found fear instead. Just before dusk, she heard horses behind her, rough voices calling out, and she felt danger closing around her. Before panic could freeze her completely, Takoda appeared on the ridge above, watching the situation with sharp eyes. He could have ignored her. He could have walked away. But something in her frightened face made him move toward her with silent speed. When the outlaws spotted him, they shouted, and everything turned chaotic. Emily did not fully understand what happened. She remembered running. She remembered Takoda grabbing her arm, not to hurt her, but to pull her away from the gang. She remembered the rough voices getting louder. She remembered tripping and falling into the dust. Townspeople misunderstood the scene and blamed the Apache man, thinking he was the danger, not the gang behind them. Takoda had no choice but to take Emily away quickly, not because he wished to, but because returning her to town would put her right into the hands of the men who wanted her. And so, they ran into the desert, away from everyone, away from everything, until the storm came and forced them into the lonely cabin where Emily now sat trembling. As Emily stared at Takoda in the dim light, she felt fear, yes, but also confusion. This man had saved her life, but she did not know why. He owed her nothing. She whispered again, "What do you want from me?" Takoda looked at the floor for a long moment and then murmured, "You are safe, for now." His tone was not threatening. It was protective. But it was also full of a warning she did not yet understand. And as the storm raged outside, Emily realized that whatever story she had stepped into, it was far bigger, and far more dangerous, than she ever imagined. The morning after the storm, Emily woke to the sound of rain dripping softly through the cabin roof, her body stiff from the cold and the long night of worry, and when she opened her eyes, Takoda was already awake, sitting near the small fire he had carefully tended, his eyes scanning the horizon beyond the broken window, as if listening for something only he could hear. Emily shivered, wondering what he was thinking, and finally found her voice, asking, "Why did you save me? Why not leave me there?" Takoda looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then simply said, "Because someone had to," and he went back to watching the rain without explaining more, leaving Emily both frustrated and curious, and she realized that she could not go back to Red Rock until she understood the dangers waiting there. She forced herself to get up, brushing the dirt from her torn dress, and Takoda offered her some water and dried bread, which she accepted with silent gratitude, noticing how carefully he moved, how his every action showed a respect and patience she had never seen in anyone else before, even though he carried the quiet weight of being a man who had known pain and loss. Once they were ready, Takoda led her out of the cabin and into the muddy desert, following trails hidden among the rocks and bushes, far from the main paths of the town, and Emily followed reluctantly, trying to match his long, steady steps, wondering how someone could move so quietly and confidently while she struggled just to keep her footing in the wet sand. Along the way, Emily began to notice small details she had never seen before, footprints of small animals in the mud, birds hiding under branches, the way Takoda paused at every sound, listening, calculating, always aware of the world around him in a way that made her feel both safe and small at the same time. She wanted to ask him so many questions, but each time she opened her mouth, he would glance at her with a calm stare that told her the answers would come in time, and not all at once. Hours passed as they walked through hills and narrow valleys, and Emily began to realize that the outlaws who had chased her were clever and dangerous, and Takoda's silence was his way of protecting her from panic, giving her a chance to survive instead of fear. At one point, Emily stumbled into a small canyon and almost fell, but Takoda's hand caught her just in time, steadying her with a gentle strength that made her heart skip a beat, and she could not help but notice the kindness in his actions, even though he said almost nothing, only watching her with eyes that seemed to hold stories of loss, revenge, and honor. Around noon, they stopped near a stream to rest, and Emily asked him again about the gang, about her groom, and about why he had taken such risks for a woman he had never met, and Takoda finally spoke longer than before, telling her that the gang had been following her because of a debt her missing husband had left behind, that they were dangerous men who would not hesitate to harm anyone in their way, and that he had known about their presence for days before they had even left the town, choosing the moment when he could move her safely. Emily listened, a mix of fear and admiration filling her chest, as she realized that this quiet, strong man had been watching over her before she even knew she needed him, and she felt a strange sense of trust beginning to grow, though she did not fully understand it yet. As the afternoon sun began to break through the clouds, they moved again, Takoda teaching her how to walk without leaving clear tracks, how to find shelter in the rocks, and how to stay calm when danger seemed near, lessons Emily had never imagined she would need, and with every step, she felt a bond forming between them, a bond built on survival, respect, and shared fear of the unknown. But even as she started to trust him, Emily's mind wandered to the letter she had seen in Takoda's bag the night before, and she wondered whose handwriting it was and what secrets it held, but every time she tried to ask, Takoda would simply shake his head or walk faster, refusing to speak, leaving her curiosity and tension growing inside her like a storm about to break. By the time they reached a small hidden valley surrounded by cliffs, the sun was low, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, and Takoda finally allowed them to rest properly, building a small fire and letting Emily sit close enough to warm herself without ever making her feel trapped or unsafe, his presence both commanding and gentle, like a shield she could lean on but never fully understand. Emily could not stop thinking about the danger that still pursued them, the outlaws tracking every step, and the feeling that her life had changed forever the moment Takoda had intervened, but at the same time, she could not deny the growing sense of awe she felt for the man who had saved her, a man whose quiet courage seemed almost like magic in the harsh desert world. As night fell, the fire flickering and shadows stretching across the valley walls, Emily realized she had survived the day not just because of luck, but because of Takoda, and although she did not yet know if she could ever trust him completely, she understood one thing clearly: in this vast, wild, and dangerous land, she would not survive without him, and for the first time since leaving Red Rock, she felt a flicker of hope that somehow, together, they could face whatever dangers the desert still held. The next morning, Emily woke to the soft light of dawn spilling across the hidden valley, the air cool and fresh after the storm, and she saw Takoda already awake, sitting silently near the small fire, sharpening a blade with careful, precise movements, and the sight of him so calm yet alert made her heart both ache and feel safe at the same time. She wanted to speak, to understand more about the man who had saved her life, but the words felt heavy in her throat, so she watched him. Noticing the way his muscles moved, the way his eyes scanned the surrounding cliffs for any sign of danger, and how even the smallest movements were full of quiet strength, a strength she could not imagine having herself. As they prepared to move again, Takoda gestured for her to follow, leading her along narrow paths carved into the rocky hills, paths that seemed invisible to anyone not familiar with the land, and Emily struggled to keep pace, stumbling over rocks and mud while Takoda moved like a shadow, always one step ahead, always calm, and she began to feel a mixture of admiration and frustration, wanting to ask him 100 questions but knowing that now was not the time, because survival came first, and understanding would have to wait. As they walked, Takoda began to teach her small lessons without speaking much, showing her how to notice the direction of the wind, how to identify safe water, how to see fresh animal tracks and know if danger was near, and Emily followed each instruction carefully, trying to match his rhythm, feeling both terrified and fascinated, realizing that this man had survived in these wild lands for a lifetime and she had barely scratched the surface of knowing the world around her. Hours passed. The sun rose higher and burned away the morning mist, and Emily began to see more of Takoda's character in small ways, the way he paused to drink water before offering her any, the way he moved rocks and branches to make their path safer, the way he never forced her to walk faster than she could, the way he sometimes looked away when she looked at him, as if holding back thoughts he did not want to share yet, and Emily began to feel the stirrings of trust and curiosity, wondering how a man so strong and silent could carry both danger and compassion in the same heart. At midday, they stopped near a small creek to rest, and Emily finally dared to ask about her missing groom, her voice trembling as she tried to understand what had happened, and Takoda's eyes darkened as he spoke, explaining that the gang that had chased her was connected to a debt her husband had left behind, that the men were dangerous and had no mercy, and that he had known of them before she ever left Red Rock, planning his movements carefully to keep her safe without drawing attention, and Emily felt a chill as the truth settled in, realizing how close she had been to real danger and how much trust she had to place in a man she barely knew. As they rested, Emily noticed a letter tucked into Takoda's bag from the previous night, and her curiosity grew until she could not resist asking about it, but Takoda only shook his head slightly and continued packing their supplies, his silence both frustrating and intriguing, leaving Emily to imagine the secrets it might hold, while at the same time she began to feel a strange connection to him, a bond forming not through words, but through shared fear, shared survival, and the quiet understanding that he had chosen to protect her at every turn. By afternoon, they reached a high ridge overlooking a canyon, and Takoda stopped to survey the land, pointing out the safest route down, showing her how to move carefully, and Emily followed, feeling the weight of her own fear and the strange reassurance of his presence. She stumbled at one point and he caught her without a word, steadying her, and the touch was brief, respectful, but enough to send a jolt through her, making her aware of how much she relied on him, not just for protection, but for guidance in this wild, unknown world. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the desert, and Emily realized that their journey was teaching her more than survival. She was learning trust, patience, and the quiet courage that came from watching someone face danger without flinching. She began to speak more to him, asking questions about the land, the animals, even the small habits of life in the desert, and Takoda responded in short, careful sentences, each one filled with meaning and wisdom, teaching her not just with words, but with actions, showing her the subtle strength that came from knowing oneself and the world around. As evening approached, they found shelter under a rock overhang, and Emily sat close to the fire while Takoda prepared a small meal of dried meat and water, offering her the first portion without hesitation, and she noticed how he respected her space, how he seemed to carry the burden of leadership and protection with quiet dignity, and she realized that this man, who had saved her life, carried more than weapons or skills. He carried honor, patience, and a sense of responsibility she had never encountered before. As night fell, the stars appearing over the desert sky, Emily could not stop thinking about the dangers still following them, the gang that wanted to find her, and the strange, growing feeling in her heart for the man who had silently guided her through the day, and even though fear and uncertainty remained, she understood one thing clearly: she would not survive without him, and slowly, she began to accept that this journey, dangerous and frightening as it was, had already changed her life forever, binding her fate to Takoda's in ways she did not yet fully understand but would learn in the days to come. The next morning, Emily awoke to the soft light filtering through the trees of the hidden valley, her mind restless with questions about the letter she had seen in Takoda's bag the night before, and without waiting for him to notice, she reached for it, carefully unfolding the paper and scanning the words with trembling hands, realizing it was addressed to her by her missing groom, though his writing was shaky and full of fear, and as she read, a wave of sorrow and confusion swept over her because the letter told a story she had not known, that her husband had been trapped by the gang, had feared for her safety, and had begged Takoda to protect her if anything happened to him, words that made her heart ache with grief and a strange relief that someone had been watching over her even before she knew the danger existed. When Takoda noticed her reading the letter, he remained silent, his face calm but heavy with emotion, and Emily felt both anger and gratitude at him, questioning why he had carried the secret for so long and why he had not spoken earlier, and yet she understood that this was not deceit, but a careful act to protect her, keeping her safe until she could understand the truth without panic overtaking her. Takoda gestured for her to follow him as he moved toward a narrow path through the rocky hills, and Emily packed the letter back carefully, her thoughts spinning, wondering how one man could carry the lives and fears of others and still move through danger as if it were a normal day, but she knew that without him, she would have been lost long ago, and that realization made her chest tighten with a mix of fear, respect, and growing trust. They moved silently through the desert terrain, and Emily noticed how Takoda paused often to listen to the wind, the rustle of animals, and even the faintest echoes that could signal danger, his eyes sharp and his movements controlled, as though every step was a test of the world around them, and she began to realize that his life had been one of constant vigilance, of survival learned from years of hardship, and that she was witnessing not just skill, but a deep wisdom that could not be taught in any school or town. By midday, they rested under the shade of a rocky overhang, and Emily could not hold back her questions any longer, asking Takoda why he had chosen to help her, why he risked himself for a stranger, and he finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, telling her that in life there were moments when the right choice was clear, even if it was difficult or dangerous, and that protecting her had been a matter of honor and duty, not obligation. And Emily felt a new layer of respect and curiosity forming in her heart as she listened to him, realizing that this man carried values deeper than she had ever imagined. As they resumed their journey, Emily tried to learn more about him, asking simple questions about his tribe, his life, and the skills he had taught her, and Takoda answered carefully, revealing just enough to satisfy her curiosity without revealing the pain he carried inside, and Emily realized that this balance of silence and teaching was a way of building trust slowly, letting her see who he was while preparing her to survive the harsh desert and the dangers still following them. By late afternoon, they reached a small stream where water ran clear between the rocks, and Takoda allowed Emily to drink first, washing her hands in the cool water, showing care and respect, and Emily felt a strange warmth in her chest at the small kindness, a human connection that contrasted with the fear and danger surrounding them, making her more aware of the bond forming between them, a bond built on trust, survival, and the quiet recognition that both had suffered losses that the other could not yet understand fully. As they rested, Emily's mind returned to the letter, and she realized that her missing groom's fear had been real, that the dangers were far from over, and that Takoda's guidance and protection were the only reason she remained alive, and she felt a mix of gratitude, sorrow, and uncertainty for the future, knowing that the journey ahead would be difficult, and that the choices she made now might define her life forever. As evening approached, the sky turning shades of orange and purple, Takoda prepared a small fire for warmth and food, and Emily watched him carefully, noticing how he moved with quiet confidence and care, each motion deliberate and purposeful, as if every action was a lesson in survival and respect, and she realized that she had not just been saved by his strength, but by his mind, his wisdom, and his deep understanding of the world around them. When night fell, the stars bright over the desert, Emily felt a sense of closeness to Takoda she had not known before, a bond born from shared fear, mutual respect, and the understanding that in this harsh and dangerous land, only by trusting each other could they survive, and though questions remained and the dangers were far from gone, Emily finally allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that together they could face whatever challenges the desert and the men hunting her would throw their way. and that the letter, though full of grief and warning, had also brought clarity. Takoda was not just a protector, but a guide, a teacher, and perhaps, in time, someone she could trust with her heart. The desert air was dry and heavy as Emily and Takoda continued their journey, moving cautiously through narrow canyons and rocky hills, the sun blazing overhead while their shadows stretched long across the sand, and Emily felt a growing awareness of the danger still following them as she noticed distant dust clouds that could signal the gang's approach, her heart beating faster each time the wind carried a faint sound of hooves or shouts, and Takoda remained calm, scanning the horizon with steady eyes, adjusting their path to avoid open spaces and leading her into hidden valleys that seemed invisible to anyone not familiar with the desert, teaching her silently how to recognize signs of danger, how to move quietly, and how to trust her instincts even when fear tried to overwhelm her. She stumbled several times, but he was always there, steadying her hand or offering a strong shoulder without a word, and Emily could not help but notice the quiet strength in every action, the patience and care he showed despite the ever-present threat, and she began to feel a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and a strange, growing dependence on him as they navigated the harsh landscape. By midday, they found a narrow cave near a cliff edge, offering shade and a temporary place to rest, and as they settled down, Emily finally asked him about his life, about his people, and about the skills he used to survive in the wild, and Takoda spoke in short, deliberate sentences, revealing a glimpse of his past. His tribe had suffered from men like the gang that hunted them. He had learned to survive through hardship and careful observation, and he had chosen to live in harmony with the land, moving silently and protecting those who could not protect themselves, and Emily listened intently, realizing that this man who appeared so quiet and reserved carried within him a lifetime of pain, wisdom, and honor that few could ever understand. As they ate a small meal of dried meat and water, Emily felt a strange connection forming between them, a bond built on shared danger, trust, and the unspoken understanding that both had suffered losses that shaped who they were, and she began to see him not just as a protector, but as a guide and companion, someone she could rely on even in the face of relentless fear. The afternoon passed slowly as they moved again, and Emily's attention was caught by subtle signs in the desert, the movement of small animals, the direction of the wind, the distant echoes of voices, and Takoda guided her carefully through the terrain, pointing out what to watch for, how to stay hidden, and how to think like someone who wanted to avoid capture, lessons that were both practical and deeply humbling, making her feel both grateful and aware of how little she had known about survival before this journey. Hours later, as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Emily noticed something worrying. The dust clouds in the distance had grown larger, and the sounds of hooves and shouted words became clearer, confirming her fears that the gang was closing in, their persistence relentless, and a chill ran down her spine as she realized the danger would not end until they were safely out of reach. Takoda noticed her tense posture and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance that spoke louder than words, and Emily felt both comforted and guilty for relying so much on him, but she knew that without his guidance, she would never have survived this long. As they approached an abandoned mining camp, Takoda signaled her to stay low, and they moved through the ruins carefully, watching for any sign of the gang, their movements slow and deliberate, each step a small victory against the ever-present threat, and Emily felt her heart pound in her chest with a mix of fear and exhilaration, realizing that she was learning courage and awareness with every step, lessons she had never imagined needing in her quiet life before Red Rock. Just as they were catching a brief moment of calm near the center of the camp, Emily heard voices close by, rough, harsh, and full of anger, and she realized with a shock that the gang had almost found them, and her pulse quickened as Takoda moved to position himself between her and the danger, his eyes cold and sharp, his body ready to act, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the true depth of his strength and the courage that had carried him through so many dangers before her. They waited silently, crouched among the ruins, listening as the gang passed nearby without noticing them, and Emily felt both relief and awe at how Takoda had guided them, teaching her without words how to survive, how to observe, and how to stay calm even when danger was right beside them. As night began to fall, painting the desert in shadows and moonlight, Emily and Takoda set up a small fire in a hidden corner of the mining camp, sharing a quiet meal while keeping watch, and Emily realized that her fear was slowly giving way to trust, respect, and a strange sense of companionship, that in this harsh, dangerous world, survival depended not only on skill but also on understanding, patience, and the bonds formed in the heat of danger, and she understood that their journey together had already changed her life in ways she could not yet fully describe, and that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, relying on each other to survive the desert, the gang, and the uncertainty of what the next day might bring. The night was quiet but heavy as Emily and Takoda moved through the desert, the moon casting pale light over the rocky terrain, and Emily's heart beat fast because she could sense the gang closing in, their distant shouts and the occasional clatter of hooves making her pulse race while Takoda remained calm, his eyes scanning every shadow, his body tense but controlled, a silent protector in the dark wilderness, and Emily could not help but feel both fear and admiration for him, realizing once again that without his knowledge and courage, she would be lost long ago, but she also felt a strange pull to stay close to him, sensing that in this moment, they depended on each other not just for survival, but for understanding the danger surrounding them. As they approached an abandoned cabin that Takoda knew well, he signaled her to stay low while he scouted the area, and Emily crouched behind a broken wall, listening to the wind and the faint sounds of the desert at night, her mind racing with worry about what might happen, and for the first time, she truly understood how dangerous their journey had become, how relentless the gang was, and how much trust she had placed in a man she barely knew, a trust that had grown with every step, every lesson, and every life-saving action he had taken to protect her. Takoda returned silently, gesturing for her to follow, and they slipped into the cabin, finding a place to hide in the shadows, the wooden walls creaking under the weight of the desert wind, and Emily could feel the tension in the air, knowing the gang would not give up easily, that they were close, and that this might be the moment when survival and courage would be tested to their limits. As the hours passed, Emily watched Takoda prepare quietly, setting traps and barricading the weaker sections of the cabin, his movements precise and deliberate, showing her not just strength but strategy, and she realized that he was thinking not only of the immediate danger, but also of the best way to protect her without putting either of them at unnecessary risk, and that careful planning had saved her life more times than she could count since the journey began. Suddenly, distant shouts grew louder, and Emily knew that the gang had arrived, surrounding the cabin without fully realizing that the two inside were prepared, and her chest tightened with fear and anticipation as Takoda whispered, "Stay behind me and stay quiet," his calm voice cutting through the panic rising inside her, and she obeyed, crouching low and gripping the edge of a broken door frame, her eyes wide and alert, her mind racing with every lesson he had taught her about survival, observation, and staying calm under pressure. The first gang member approached the cabin carelessly, unaware of the traps Takoda had set, and Takoda moved with the quiet precision of a predator, intercepting him before he could raise an alarm, while Emily held her breath, heart thundering, realizing how close danger had come and how skillful Takoda was, not only in fighting but in thinking ahead, using the environment and every advantage he could find to protect them both, and she felt a mix of awe, fear, and gratitude for the man who had saved her life over and over again. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional voice of the gang outside or the wind rattling the cabin, and Emily could feel herself growing stronger, more aware, more attuned to the desert and to Takoda, understanding that survival required not just courage but calm observation and trust in those who had earned it, and she realized that in the harsh desert, the bond between them had become more than just protection, it was partnership, trust, and a shared will to survive no matter what. As midnight approached, the gang attempted to storm the cabin, but Takoda anticipated every move, leading Emily to follow silently as he positioned himself between her and the danger, using shadows and his knowledge of the land to confuse and delay the attackers, and Emily felt her heart leap as she saw his courage and intelligence in action, realizing that every lesson he had given her, every careful move through the desert, had prepared them for this final confrontation, and that together they could face even the most relentless threat. The fight outside the cabin grew tense, with shouts and the sound of men scrambling over rocks and broken wood, but Takoda remained calm, calculating, striking only when necessary, and guiding Emily to move carefully, avoiding danger while staying close, and Emily felt a mixture of fear and empowerment, knowing that she was not helpless, that she had learned from the strongest and wisest guide she could ever have, and that her life depended on their teamwork, their trust, and the bond that had grown quietly over days of walking, hiding, and surviving together. Finally, just as the gang seemed on the verge of breaking through, distant voices rang out across the desert, carrying the authority and certainty of lawmen from Red Rock, and the attackers faltered, realizing they were trapped between the cabin and arriving help, and Emily felt relief flood through her as the lawmen moved swiftly to capture the gang, ending the threat that had haunted her since she left her town. And she looked at Takoda with gratitude and admiration, realizing that their journey had not only saved her life, but had created a connection between them that neither danger nor distance could erase, a bond formed in the harsh desert under the pressure of fear, trust, and survival, a bond that would carry them forward into the unknown days ahead. The first light of dawn crept over the desert, painting the cliffs and valleys with soft gold, and Emily sat quietly beside Takoda, the events of the night still heavy in her mind. The danger finally passed but the memories vivid, and she felt a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and wonder at how much her life had changed in just a few days. The lawmen from Red Rock had arrived in time to capture the gang, their presence breaking the grip of fear that had followed her since leaving her town, and she looked at Takoda with gratitude, realizing that without him, she would not have survived, and more than that, she felt a deep respect and admiration for the man whose courage, wisdom, and quiet strength had guided her through every moment of danger, teaching her lessons of survival, patience, and trust that she had never imagined she would need in her life. Takoda, still alert but finally able to relax, watched the sun rise over the horizon, his eyes reflecting both relief and the faint sadness of a man who had carried burdens alone for so long, and Emily could sense the depth of his thoughts, the weight of the past, and the quiet honor that had guided his actions from the first moment he had saved her, and she felt her own heart stirring with emotions she could not yet name, a combination of gratitude, connection, and the strange comfort of knowing she was no longer alone in a harsh world. As they began to move away from the cabin, Emily stepped close to him, careful not to crowd him but wanting to be near, and Takoda's gaze softened, acknowledging the bond that had grown silently between them during days of fear, walking, and survival, a bond born from necessity but strengthened by understanding, shared hardships, and mutual respect, and Emily realized that for the first time since leaving Red Rock, she felt a sense of safety not only in the desert but in the presence of this man who had become her protector, guide, and companion. They walked slowly toward the path leading back to the main road, the desert now quiet except for the gentle rustle of the wind and the distant calls of birds, and Emily could not stop thinking about the letter from her missing groom, the fear and grief it had carried, and the lessons she had learned through every step of the journey, lessons that had taught her strength, patience, and courage she had never known she possessed, and she felt a sense of growth and understanding that filled her with both pride and humility, knowing that danger had tested her in ways she could not have imagined but had also shown her who she truly was. As the morning grew brighter, Takoda finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the faint weight of emotion, saying, "The desert is full of dangers, but together, we can face what comes," and Emily nodded, understanding that his words were more than guidance, they were trust, an acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, and a promise of shared strength, and she felt a quiet smile form on her lips, realizing that she no longer needed to fear the unknown because she had learned to rely on both her courage and the loyalty of someone who had earned her trust completely. As they reached the edge of the desert where the main road stretched toward Red Rock, Emily paused, looking back at the path they had taken, the cliffs, the valleys, the hidden trails, and she felt a strange sadness for the journey that was ending, for the danger that had tested them, and for the lessons that could only be learned through fear and trust, and she realized that her life had changed forever, that the woman who had left her home days ago was no longer the same, that she had grown stronger, wiser, and braver because of what she had faced. With Takoda by her side, Takoda watched her quietly, his expression unreadable but gentle, and he repeated the line he had said to her long ago in the cabin, the line that had held so much meaning, "Stop me when it's too much," and Emily felt a warmth in her chest as she looked at him, realizing that it was no longer a warning, but a bond, a shared understanding that they had survived together, that they had faced fear and danger and had come through it stronger, and she replied softly, "It isn't too much." Not anymore, and the words felt true in the still desert air, carrying a sense of peace, connection, and closure. They continued walking together, side by side, the wind soft against their faces, the sun rising fully over the land, and Emily realized that while the journey through danger was over, the path ahead, whatever it might hold, would be walked together, guided by trust, respect, and the quiet courage that had grown between them, and she knew that her life, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now held hope, strength, and the possibility of a future shaped not just by survival, but by the bond of two souls brought together by fate, danger, and the lessons of the harsh and beautiful desert. As they finally reached the main road, Takoda and Emily paused, looking toward the distant town of Red Rock, knowing that while the town might offer safety, it could never replicate the growth, trust, and courage they had earned together in the wild, and Emily felt a smile form on her lips, a mixture of relief, pride, and anticipation for the life ahead, knowing that the journey had ended but the bond they shared would continue, strong and unbreakable, a quiet testament to courage, survival, and the power of trust between two people who had found each other in the midst of danger and the wild, untamed desert.